In this video, I will provide an introduction to design patterns. What I love about coding is that the only limit is your imagination. Every day, you get to face new challenges, and there are no rules that say you must follow these exact steps to get to this exact solution. You're responsible for finding a solution that's the right trade-off between all of your design constraints, between complexity and elegance, between performance and maintainability, and between cost and functionality. But this is also a scary responsibility. How do you know which solution will work? How do you explain your ideas to your colleagues? Where do you even begin? With experience, some of this will come naturally, but even experienced developers do take advantage of proven solutions. When you ask an architect to build a house, he or she doesn't normally start from first principles, deciding whether to put the toilet in the living room. Instead, there are proven conventions and patterns that the architect will draw on for inspiration and guidance. Each time, these conventions and patterns will be used in a different way, and perhaps sometimes ignored completely. But there are recognizable patterns in architecture. For example, a room should generally have windows on at least 2 sides, and warm pools of light should be created in places where people congregate to socialize. These conventions are known as design patterns. In 1977, Christopher Alexander, Sarah Ishikawa, and Murray Silverstein wrote a book called A Pattern Language that laid out patterns for architectural problems. In the introduction, they defined patterns like this. Each pattern describes a problem which occurs over and over again in our environment, and then describes the core of the solution to that problem in such a way that you can use the solution 1,000,000 times over without ever doing it the same way twice. The key thing to note from this is that patterns are just guidelines. They can be adapted to suit your particular situation. You don't need to follow them as though they're a strict rule. Instead, they're the collected wisdom of many people who found a solution to a common problem. This wisdom can provide insight and help, but it shouldn't be blindly followed without understanding. So what actually is a design pattern? Alexander, in the 1979 book, The Timeless Way of Building, explains that each pattern is a 3-part rule which expresses a relationship between a certain context, a problem, and a solution. Software engineers have embraced this idea, and we have a number of classic books in software design patterns. You've probably already heard of Gang of 4 many times in your studies. If not, then I recommend reading it. The patterns in Gang of 4 are now part of the day-to-day vocabulary of a working developer. The other books listed here are also excellent, but they contain more specialized patterns for enterprise development. I asked earlier, how do you know which solution to a problem will work? How do you explain your ideas to your colleagues? And where do you even begin? Knowing design patterns is important for your career because they can help you answer these questions. Design patterns codify the wisdom of many experts. By using a design pattern, you know that you're using a solution that's worked many times before. Design patterns help you communicate your ideas to other developers. Because a design pattern has a name, you can say something like, oh, I've encapsulated the database in a data access object where values are passed between layers using a data transfer object. A developer familiar with the data access object pattern will immediately have some idea of what to expect in your code. And more short-term, design patterns are also popular questions for job interviews. Finally, design patterns can help narrow down possible designs and architectures. This can help you avoid bad ideas and let you focus on the essential business logic of the problem and speed up your problem solving. So far in this subject, in the videos, the readings and the tutorials, we've already seen a few design patterns, but I didn't call them that at the time. The readings for this week include several design patterns. I'd like you to read them and think about whether you've already seen them, perhaps in this subject, or perhaps also in other subjects and other systems that you've built previously. Just don't be overwhelmed by the structure of a pattern. They typically follow a fairly formal structure, but they essentially describe a relationship between those 3 parts that Christopher Alexander talked about: a context, a problem, and the solution. Here's the template used by Krupi, Allure, and Moggs. You'll notice it starts with a name, and you can use that to talk about it with other developers. Then it describes the context. The context is the situation that you'll encounter the problem. When would you encounter the problem, and what are the constraints are there when the problem arises? Next, it explains the problem and also the forces that are factors that would influence the solution. Then finally, it gets into the details of the solution, including the implementation, as well as the strategies, the common variations on the solution. It goes into the consequences. This is a discussion of the trade-offs involved in the solution. And then finally has some sample code. Every pattern book uses a slightly different template, but they're essentially the same. And here's a simplified version. So, to conclude, the main point of this video is that a design pattern is a rule with a name that relates a context, a problem, and a solution. As a professional developer, you will need to be familiar with design patterns to build better systems and also to communicate with your colleagues. But remember, they're just guidelines. You don't have to follow them exactly. Just use them to inspire your solution, but adapt them to the precise needs of your system.